All right, so we'll begin with the prayer. We also ask the saints of today to pray for us: Isaac Jogues, Jean de Brébeuf, and companions of the North American martyrs. These are men who, Jesuits from France, who we remember today as having come to a very beautiful land. America has its beauty, and it is a place in God's creation, but they also brought something even more beautiful, the name of Christ. And they were very courageous, heroic. So let's just ask them to pray for us, intercede for Anthony too, because it's their feast day. And I'll also pray this prayer, which I think connects well to art. It's attributed, it's prayer of the church. I've heard it attributed to Thomas Aquinas some, but I'll just pray this simply. Father, may everything we do begin with your inspiration and continue with your saving help. Let our work always find its origin in you, and through you reach completion. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. So we welcome back for our third and final class, Anthony Visco. And I wanted to have a brief quote too, just because Anthony is a great artist. He does great work. He's well known. I think of a small quote that Jordan of Saxony said of St. Dominic. Jordan was his successor, and he said of St. Dominic, this is from his book, The Libellus 107, and I'll just read this very simply. All men were swept into the embrace of his charity. And he's saying of Dominic, because he loved all, he was loved by all. And I think that can be attributed some to Anthony Visco, because we have many people tuning in that love him because he's not just a teacher, but I think he has real charity, and that's the real crown of creation, to have love. And so, Anthony, thank you for this series, and we're excited for tonight.
Well, as I was saying earlier, I want to bring the last two together, between Saint Dominic being the patron saint of astronomy. We're not sure how, but that's not what the lecture is going to be about, as much as he and St. Francis, patron saint of ecology. The course is about both. It's about creation. It's about all creation, and how, when people would ask me, where do you get your sense of composition, I would say from anatomy and landscape. And well, what do you mean by you get your sense of composition for all these other things from anatomy and landscape? And the only answer I can come up with was they both have a sense of an inevitability to them. And then this course actually starts in New York. I was teaching at the New York Academy at the time, and I was asked to introduce a new course called The History of Sculpture Techniques. And at first, I thought, oh gee, I don't want to do a sculpture materials and techniques class by materials, how to cast, how to mold this, or do this kind of clay versus that kind of clay. So I thought, why not 3 different sculptural ideas, starting out with the most static and going to the most dynamic. So I started out, the students doing a Kouros figure, as you see here on the screen, just one step forward, and what that meant in Greek culture, and then going on to a Roman, Greco-Roman / Renaissance model of contrapposto, and what that meant. And we see that, of course, in Michelangelo's David. And then on to more or less a triaxial kind of Baroque ongoing pose. And we did that for a few years. And then one night I went to a lecture given by a woman here in Philadelphia named Anna Griswold Ting. She was the assistant to Louis Kahn, the famous Philadelphia architect. And Anna said, she was talking about architecture, but she said, there are 4 different types, or 4 different cycles. It goes from bilateral to rotational to helical and to spiral. Well, I was dealing with this static to contrapposto to more of a spiral pose, never thinking about the helical. And it just all came together. And Anna described how these 4 things are in creation itself. They're in the cosmos, that we have these nebulae. They are bilateral, and they are rotational. This one, in fact, is called the Eye of God. They are helical, and they are spiral. So and how these four types exist in mostly everything under the sun. And so she pointed out how this bilateral architecture is, inherent in Greek and Roman architecture. The rotational is the same. And what it meant in terms of, here's helical, what these things meant, and how the bilateral had more to do with eternity and synchronicity between heaven and earth. And then we go on to the spiral modality. And it just all made too much sense to me. And I thought, how does this occur in other art forms, not just architecture? Here we have an example of a Duncan Stroik bilateral church. This is the Church of St. Thomas Aquinas in California. And I don't know the architect of this other one on the side. But one thing, I'm pointing this out because Anna said one thing in particular that stuck in my head. And she said, we are in the spiral modality right now. And it deals with hyper individualism. You can have good spiral and you can have good or bad of any one of these. But she said things are, and this has to be about 25 years ago. She said things are going to heat up at the end of the spiral modality. And things can get chaotic, and you're going to see a conflict between the bilateral and the spiral. And I think it's become quite obvious today, so many levels. So I started to investigate, and I thought, let me see how this exists in the visual arts, not just architecture, but in painting, sculpture, drawing, etc. So I just want to run through a series of Last Suppers, even though this is not split down the middle. It's a horizontal split, but it's still bilateral, as is this one by Ghirlandaio. Christ isn't right in the center, but he's central. So we'll talk about center and central, two different things, and how we get to use that. This is an Andrea del Sarto. Christ is in the center. He's both center and central. This is rotational. You start to see that, especially when the back is turned to the viewer. We are not on the other side of the table as we see in some of these other Last Suppers. Another rotational one by Poussin. Judas we're sitting with Judas now. Very different. So you can see how taking these different modalities can actually alter the content and give a different view. This is Tintoretto always being the most dynamic or more helical. Another version. This is quite dynamic with Tintoretto doing a night scene. Christ is not in the center, although he is isolated by the aura and halo. And this I put into the spiral modality. Why spiral modality? It's because it's not a spiral in terms of shape. So spiral modality doesn't necessarily mean it's a spiral shape. It means there's a loss of gravity. There's a transparency between elements. And of course, no one does this better than Dali. It's a bilateral composition, but a spiral in terms of the uniqueness, and that it's a reception of the improbable. But in our case, with transubstantiation, it's not, of course. So this is another version of the Last Supper. I'm not quite sure what it means. This is where the spiral becomes somewhat chaotic. However, I didn't think of it as 4 parts. I start to think it's really more like 6. And so I added 2 more nebulae. One is the monolithic. This was actually called Pillars of Heaven, this nebula. It's wonderful. And composite, because as going through these compositions, whether they're architectural or painting, sculpture, whatever, I could even apply this to music and it works. If we were to say, well, what is the monolithic modality of music? Right away I'd say, well, they're anthems. They're singular notes, one built on top of another. It doesn't repeat. It's totemic. And when we look at the monolithic modality, we realize that it is quite totemic, as all societies will begin as a totemic structure, all right, going toward heaven, this connection between earth and the celestial, as we build one on top of the other. Again, like I said before, this is cross-cultural. And we know from the Egyptian obelisks, the writing on it is totemic as well. It constantly tells the story of the people. So one thing becomes communal. Here's ours in Washington, D.C. The monolith can also be a figure, could also be a sculpture. And we see this repeated time and time again, sometimes making it into a, this is Vigeland, sometimes making it totemic, not necessarily in symbols like we see in other indigenous peoples, Aboriginal and Native American. So this idea of monolith remains with us. The bilateral modality, I mean, one could say a tower is a monolithic architectural form, but usually we reserve it for a column, a statue, etc. Bilateral modality we see, of course, in plant form. When I start to think of the days of creation, do them in those orders, it holds up just as well. And that's why I call it creation and the canons of composition. Where left mirrors right, right mirrors left on a bilateral axis. And sometimes not identical. In the lobster, it's not, but and of course, it's bilateral on what we call the sagittal plane, where we're split down the middle, but not in half, not transversely, and not front to back. And of course, we can see how the bilateral by this Francesco Di Giorgio drawing lends itself to the floor plans of a lot of architecture, still does. And again, we're slowly getting back to this. This is Alberti's design for San Sebastiano. Alberti was an incredible mathematician as well, or I should say geometrist. This has more to do with geometry than math. This is San Miniato, not his, but nevertheless an incredible design. And again, the bilateral in terms of the human figure has to do with a certain equality. If we start to look at them over and over again, there's an equality of position. Here, not so, but if we look at it more carefully, we could see how the expressions say they're not equal. So this is another device that for the representational artists, especially doing anything with a narrative, it doesn't work for non-figurative art as well. And that's, I think that's part of the reason why anyone who's been to art school, when your teachers would say, never put anything in the middle of the canvas, never put anything in the middle, they're terrified of it because it means something. Fra Angelico separates it with architecture here. But here, when we see two figures side by side, equidistant from the viewer, that means equality of station. Again, we have John the Baptist centered, Christ in the background. But right now, this is that episode, that moment where they're asking the Baptist, is it you? And he said, no, it's me. It's not me. It's the one who is following. So this is always the way that, not always, but it's one of the ways this gets represented. Sometimes it's empty, where there's nothing in the center, and this also says something. This is the Annunciation to Zechariah. Great painting by Millet of the Angelus, where we can see the church in the background, but the equality of station between the two peasants, equidistant from each other and equidistant from the viewer. Here's 3 images of marriage, where we can see that not only are they equal, but it's always right in the middle of the composition. Here's another device for not equal. This is the famous painting by Piero del Francesca of the Flagellation of Christ, where we have 2 different groups, and Christ not only is in the background. This is another device used in all forms of art, but it has a great meaning in this flagellation painting, and we could see how Christ is the smallest out of all the figures. This, of course, is Da Vinci's Annunciation. There's another talk I've been working on that was actually recommended by an OGBYN in Florence, the 3 different expressions of Mary: fear, surprise, and acceptance, and how that gets portrayed in all these great Annunciation paintings. Bilateral can also be higher and lower, like I was saying before. This is a great example by Sandro Botticelli. Also, the fear element is in this one, because after all, the angelic salutation is fear not. So obviously, some artists have decided to show that fear before the final yes. This is the Verrocchio. He does 2 bilateral compositions in one: the 2 angels and St. John and Christ figure. Of course, this all becomes something else when it's a bilateral composition. One figure is clearly elevated above the others. Sacred Conversation, again, we discussed this in the St. Francis lecture as well. Judgment of Solomon by Poussin. Beheading of the Baptist. Goes on. This is one of the most common, but unfortunately not used as well or as often today in art or architecture. Sculpturally, we can do the same thing. This is Donatello's Creation of Eden. This is a wonderful clay relief he did. Another Visitation by Della Robbia. This is in the round, which is rare for Della Robbia, but Incredulity of St. Thomas by Verrocchio. And of course, a lot of sculpture is sort of, it's tough because when we get to things like this, it's not, it's bilateral, but of course it's also in the round. But the one side does mirror the other. And of course, Michelangelo's Medici tombs are bilateral compositions, but the figures are not. And we'll discuss that more in a bit. Oh, sorry. The rotational modality, it has to do with the rational expansion. It's authority over environment or familiarity over environment. It's also part of a collective. And we'll see that more and more as we do look into the architecture and the painting. Of course, it's in many plant forms. as well as C forms. Mammals don't come round, but architecture can. And Father Tim was mentioning earlier the round church, the church and the round, and we have history of that. But for very, very, very different reasons. We have cities that are based on this. Entire populations or city plans are either rectangular, more like Philadelphia, or circular. Radial. Okay. So we all recognize Stonehenge right away as being not only tribal but circular, bringing all together for certain occasions, for definite occasions. This is a drawing of Santo Stefano in Rome, and when modern architects say, well, we did have the round church, but my issue with this is, yes, Santo Stefano is an incredible round church. However, liturgy was so different that it wasn't anything like our liturgy of today. You didn't walk up an aisle to receive the Eucharist. All church architecture changed as the liturgy changed, and appropriately so. To go back to this, I call this sort of like catacomb girl, catacomb boy. They want to go back to the year 300 and they don't know why. And it's really more, again, to be unique and individual in this spiral period than actually the radial period. Now the Pantheon is radial and now a church, but it's not mass in the round. It's a big difference. So the altar is against the furthest wall, not in the middle of it, as some of these more modern radial churches are being designed. Incredible oculus. And here, of course, is the Dome of St. Peter's, designed by Michelangelo, who admitted he could make it bigger, but not better than the Brunelleschi cupola. So this is combinations, bilateral and rotational. Of course, the interiors of these are most often with incredible decorations that also continue that idea. Some do more than others. This one on the right it really is more of an easel painting that goes up rather than a real radial or rotational painting. And this idea of community. So we see this very, very frequently in art, this ring of people dancing. This is Lorenzetti's fresco, Good Government. And of course, we have this mystical nativity of Botticelli, which really expresses authority over environment, this ring of angels over the head of, over the Presepio there, dropping crowns. He did this after he had a major conversion from secular art to sacred art, again with the influence of the great Dominican Savonarola, who we discussed last week. Another Poussin. This concept of this ring with facing out rather than facing in also speaks about this collective consciousness, an awareness of the outside as well as the inside. And if you were to ask me, did these artists know this when they were doing it? They intuit. We can intuit these things. I don't think it's because they're universals. And we see it repeated period after period after period. So it doesn't have to be a complete circle, but this really is a bilateral plus radial composition of the Coronation of the Virgin by Fra Angelico. giving of, again, as soon as we do these in representational art, and we show the backs of the figures in the foreground, we are in a radial or rotational modality. Another, Poussin did a series of paintings, the Seven Sacraments, and this is one of his Last Supper paintings. There's another element here. The light is radial, and we use that in art as well. We could do it more in painting than any other form, but radial light is a circular happening. This is Della Robbia from the Cantoria. So it can be done sculpturally as well. This is Donatello, the pulpit from the outdoor ambo from the church in Prato. And this is concave rather than convex. This is the Quattro Coronati, the four sculptors who were martyred for not making an idol. This is the Fountain of the Turtles in Rome, excuse me. So rotational is great for public art in particular, but also can be used very, very well in painting and architecture, all of it. The helical modality is really the one that I was most fascinated with because it was the one I was missing in my talks. I went from something more serpentine and then spiral. But the helical, when Anna first started to talk about it, I thought this is a missing link for my understanding of all this, because it goes up and down. But just like the monolith might go toward the heavenly, the helical is between earth and below the earth. And there's always some sort of metamorphosis that occurs when we use it in art. So we see it in nature for sure. And of course, we can see it in these drawings early. That the one on the left is one of the earliest drawings of DNA. Da Vinci did helix drawings as well, trying to figure out how to get these things operating. And of course, this wonderful helical column made of chain, carved though, of knots and chains. The double helix staircase designed by Da Vinci. Of course, you have the great helical staircase going to in Vatican museums. Here's Bernini's original drawing for the Baldacchino. When you start to understand this a little more, you say that no wonder these great masters used these devices throughout history. Here's a series of helical columns with the Via Crucis on them, the way the crosses on them as they tell a story going up. Hadrian's column does the same thing. I would say the master of the helix in both painting, sculpture, and drawing, not architecture, but painting, sculpture, and drawing, is Michelangelo. There's not too many things he does without it. It's his favorite device because he is always going from one state to another. So it's and you think about the period where there was a lot of turmoil at the time between the discovery of America, Martin Luther. Michelangelo lived an incredible time, not for the ability to do this, but how to reconcile it in his work. This is Pontormo. This is his Annunciation. Two helical figures. And with the human body, the helix comes about by overlapping of limbs, more like a windmill kind of effect. Turmo, and Michelangelo, by the way, after the ceiling was cleaned, we saw it, uses another device called cangiante, which the colors don't make sense either. They turn in a way they shouldn't turn. Here's the ascension done quite clearly as a helix, and the Assumption of the Virgin are the same. Now, there's something that happens and in anatomically that I've always been fascinated by, and that is when the arm is put in a position that we call forced pronation, the structure actually becomes very helical, and it gets repeated. I'm not quite sure, again, is it just from artists seeing other artists do it, or is it something intuitive? Here's a Titian on one side and a Franco Zeffirelli on the other. Of course, the bilateral composition with the helix of the serpent between the two, this metamorphosis that goes from the underworld up to the world, from beneath to time. And of course, in architecture, this is another form where the helical figures are the columns. Michelangelo, again, using the helical. So even though the composition of the Medici tombs are bilateral, the figures are helical. This is Mochi. Mochi does the great large figures that are around the Baldacchino in the Vatican, and always in this state of ongoing. The Madonna actually tips her chair in his carving. They were in the cathedral in Orvieto, and unfortunately were taken down and put somewhere in the basement because somebody decided that they weren't appropriate for the more Gothic interior upstairs. Again, Bernini, very, very different David, helical. And of course, this gives evidence as well of it having to do with metamorphosis in his Daphne Apollo. It's always an abrupt change of one kind of life to another when we're using the spiral modality. Here's the anatomical version of this forced pronation I spoke of earlier. Michelangelo uses it for his Sleep of Adam as well. And here's the Rubens version of it. I've done this in anatomy class sometimes where I have the model pose and have them do this. And a couple times the students would get a little upset, and I'd say, I was questioning, what's the problem? He looks dead. So it's got to be something that we sort of understand on a very basic intuitive level. Spiral modality. This deals a lot with the uniqueness of things. And we see it in the Gothic, of course, and what becomes so unique in the Gothic is that the carvers were allowed to be unique in that each one was told, do a gargoyle and make it as horrific as you can. This was sort of an experiment of creativity for them. So the spiral in plant form is just amazing. You know, you look at these things, and I'm not sure if I want to draw them or eat them, you know. And of course, in sea life, it's plentiful. And here's the chambered nautilus, which we'll talk about in the future as well. And this is us. We have every one of these things. We're bilateral, we're helical, we're spiral, all of it, radial, you name it. We have all these modalities in our bodies. Geometric versions, the volute of the ionic capital. We have great examples of the Book of Kells at St. Patrick's in the lower church. And of course, architecturally, or city design. The illustration of Dante's Inferno is a spiral downward. The great Cathedral of Milan, most Gothic structures are considered spiral because they sort of transcend solidity. It's not just their uniqueness, but the spires and the light that comes through things. These are two examples of the buttresses of Milan, which you can go and see, and it's like going through a incredible forest when you're up there. And these are two ambos during the Rococo period, which we call Rococo, but it really is a spiral modality. I had great problems with the Rococo when I was in art school, mainly because, well, everything was stripped down in the modernist 60s, so this really made no sense. And then I bought a small book about Rococo, not ecclesiastic artwork, but just the period. And when it got to the ecclesiastic works, it said something that really stuck in my head, that the idea was there's no such thing as being excessive when you're trying to describe the eternal. Made sense. And here we have it again today with the ongoing Sagrada Familia by Gaudi. And you can see that sort of, again, Gothic ornamentation that is being invested into the stone, concrete. This is an Aboriginal cave painting that I've always found their work very, very intriguing, because again, it's tribal, but no specific pattern. Every hand is a unique individual, but yet all coming together. These are some of Da Vinci's drawings of water, and last year I got to witness how unbelievably crazy the Arno River can get after days and days of rain. Very frightening, very forceful. Now, these two paintings in particular by El Greco. El Greco is pretty much always in the spiral modality. Sometimes does a composite, but more or less always, where the rationality of space has collapsed. This is not perspectival space that we saw in the Renaissance paintings. And also there's another thing that's happening between Pontormo, Fiorentino Rosso, Michelangelo, and El Greco, and that is the Council of Trent. And after so many works were destroyed by the Reformation, Trent actually recommended that perhaps we have to return to something a little more mystical, that we've been too rational, too worldly, too earthly with our depictions here. So you can see proportions change. There is no logistic constancy between light, form, and space, which is actually very, very central to this whole spiral modality. Tiepolo, fastest brush in the West, was an absolute genius at this. How to have total loss of gravity form all of it, inconsistent light, and yet it holds together beautifully. I think this one on the left I showed last week, that's St. Dominic. And this sort of breaking the borders between the supposed physical and two-dimensional and three-dimensional. Some of them do it to such a point that you can't really tell where one thing begins and one thing ends. This is Blake. So it continued. Now an artist can do, one thing that I've learned is an artist can not do one thing. As I said about El Greco, he was pretty much always in that modality, but an artist can have all 4, 5, 6 of these things in their career, depending on what they're doing at a certain time. If the content calls for it, you do it. And that's certainly true in artists like Ghiberti. This is a Bavarian church. I don't know how that stays up there. It's okay. I'll accept it. And of course, this combination of both actual and implied form, actual and implied light, with this Bernini St. Teresa in Ecstasy. This is Frederick Hart, who did the central tympanum at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., ex nihilo. And of course, he uses the spiral modality to depict the creation. And the two smaller ones, one of the creation of the sun, the other the creation of the moon. These were done in the 60s. The composite modality is when 2 or more of these modalities are being combined. And we certainly see it in this Tintoretto on the left. He's got radial, bilateral, all of them. And the same on the right, where it's essentially bilateral at the top and gets more and more, let's say, chaotic on the way down. The doors of Milan have the same thing. They use different scales of figures, very much of a composite series of relationships. And of course, the 20th century master of the composite is Salvador Dali, where he is dissolving, again, perspective, gravity, all of it, different scales combined. Here's another example of the dissolvement between the actual and implied. We have radial, bilateral, composite, clearly. Same thing here with this altar of St. Michael. Helical, bilateral, radial in the ceiling coming down. I showed you some of these last week, but so sometimes I examine my work and say, well, what is that? What is that modality you did there? So radial again. Helical. Spiral. Now, again, as I said earlier, it can be done in secular art, and one person who I found really true to this And again, Painting from Life was Vincent van Gogh. Here's a monolithic composition. It's a bilateral composition. Radial light, rotational composition. Radial composition. Spiral. And composite. You pretty much did it all. Now, the question of, because I know somebody's going to ask the sacred geometry. The reason why I put a question mark here is it sacred? Well, after seeing all this, you realize if geometry is sacred, then everything I showed is sacred. All plant forms are sacred. All seashells are sacred. I just prefer it as their proportions. Do I use it? Yes, no. Do I teach it? Yes, no. Mainly because I'd rather just stick to the idea of proportions and balance and composition. But we do see it used in art and art history and architecture, where architects will design something based on a proportional rhythm one to the other, just like a musician would. This is Brunelleschi's 5 circles for the diameter and then the arc. He was commissioned to do the cupola al quinto punto at the 5 circles there. It was originally at 4 and it became too pointed and he didn't like it, so he changed it and it worked. Absolute genius. This is again Pier della Francesca. This is a square and a circle, which is basically a 2-3 ratio. I've got 1, 2, 3 parts to this, where the square divided in half is another half of the square. If I do anything, or I recommend or I teach this as well, it's root rectangles because they are harmonic. There's not involved with numbers at all. It's just how one thing begets another. It's sort of like a natural growth or an organic form of geometry. So if the square is root 1, we can see that in the Botticelli. Botticelli also uses root 2, which we can see in that nativity I'd shown you earlier. A lot of architecture uses root 2. Root 2 is a very harmonic proportion. Here's another Nicolas Poussin drawing of the Holy Family. Root 2. Root 3. Another harmonic proportion. Root 4 is actually a double square and not often used, but it can be used. It's still, you know. And I think this is much, much better for the artist than using a manufacturer's size, just whatever size the drawing pad or the book comes or the canvas comes. This is a root 5. Da Vinci uses it for this Annunciation painting. Michelangelo uses it for every one of those panels in the Sistine Chapel ceiling. You see how you can see how well it fits. And the big question is the golden section. Does it get used? Yes. The problem is that people think if they use it, their work is going to be good. It's sort of like, oh, if I cover with gold leaf, I've got some wonderful thing. The golden section is no guarantee. Is it from nature? Absolutely. Absolutely. We can see it over and over again in the human body. Our fingers, our hands grow in terms of 1, 1, 2, 3, 5. Fibonacci series. For those of you who are familiar with the Fibonacci series, we have it inherent in our bodies. Here's examples of golden section used where it just is obviously, it's not, like I've said before, it's no guarantee. Here's Pantheon. Another, this is a, no, it's not a Poussin. Who is this? I forget. Anyway, sorry. And Da Vinci uses it in his both versions of his Madonna of the Rocks. And as I said earlier, we have a period now where we're leaving, hopefully leaving the chaos of the spiral modalities. Again, spiral modality is not the issue as much as when it gets hyper individualistic and it no longer reflects the values of that we have in common, then it's going awry a bit. So part of it was the switch over from proportions. Here on the left, we have the Da Vinci model, and on the right, we have Le Corbusier, his reinvention of the Vitruvian Man, okay? And you can see what happens as a result. Becomes inverted. The spiral becomes an inverted spiral. This is the Guggenheim Museum. They say Guggenheim hated paintings, and that's why he has them looking, you have to look at them while you're climbing a ramp. So everything is thrown off a little bit. I don't even know what this wants to be honest with you. But here's an interesting example where we have the Arnolfo di Cambio seated figure of St. Peter's in Rome, where the foot is completely worn down from people touching it because it's public and it's meant to be. Whereas the Giacomo Manzu is in the Getty Museum, untouchable. So we have to start looking at what happened in this period where great art can become so museumized that it's no longer part of our public fabric. The idea that, oh, the Renaissance and all these periods used their most famous artists to do church art. Here's a Pomodoro. He's a very, very, very famous gallery artist, a museum artist, but commissioned to do an altar in a tabernacle. I'm sorry, but it doesn't quite make it for me. Here is the new baptismal font at one of the oldest churches in all of Florence, San Miniato al Monte, where alabaster is used, nothing representational, translucency of materials, again, part of something that can happen in the spiral modality. To me, it's evidence that we are here, as well as the millennial church that was built in Rome and the figure of John Paul. These are two of the more famous and used artists in Florence today. Filippo Rossi and I'm sorry, I forget the name of the gentleman on the right. In the background is Michelangelo's crucifix, by the way. And this was his delivery this past year of his nativity, his Precepio. And that is what was placed in the church. And here, of course, is the cardinal and everybody else applauding this new nativity set that they got. It's I don't even know what to say when I saw some of these things in person, and to see them in that incredible Brunelleschi with the Michelangelo and everything else, and great altar and tabernacle. This is art about art now. Speaking of the radial church, the one on the right, I think it's St. Anthony somewhere, and you can see how it's going here. The one on the left is our sort of what is our prison here, right here on the Eastern State Penitentiary. Not too different. And the biggest complaint about the Eastern State Penitentiary, and I think it would be also for these radial churches, was the loneliness. It doesn't give a sense of community as much as they're intended to. that people can get very, very distant from each other. And of course, it forces another kind of liturgy as well, where you don't have that central nave for the reception of the Eucharist. It forces one to have, 8 Eucharistic ministers. This again is another Filippo Rossi on one side and a James Langley on the other. Both are triptychs. Both are being done today. So I think, again, this is a good example of this spiral modality between the communal joining of the synchronicity between heaven and earth, and the other simply about the individual. But there are a lot of people doing a lot of things. This Oleg Sparecchio, he is doing some phenomenal things in Italy. He's a Russian artist, Russian-Italian. And his sense of relief quality on these monochromatic paintings is quite remarkable. This Polish artist I find also quite interesting because he, in every station of his, Our Lady is represented by the icon of Our Lady Czestochowa. This is Martino Correa. He's a Canadian artist doing some very good work. And this is Raul Berzosa again, just doing wonderful, wonderful paintings for a lot of churches here. This is Daphne Dubarry. She's a French sculptor. She does a lot of her work in Pietrasanta, where I met her. Gets a lot of her stone casting done there. This is Foucault on one side, and John the Baptist she did for the Island of Malta. Beautiful work. And this is Jeb Gibbons, who actually has courses in doing these small manuscript illuminations, grinding the pigment on down. They're just little gems, beautiful. And here's George Nista with the work in progress for the Tilma sculpture at Our Lady of Guadalupe in Buckingham, PA. From clay to plaster to finished patina with the icon in the middle. Here's Cuba Ambrose. Again, I showed him last week. He's really producing some, I would put him in this, even though this is a bilateral composition, because of how he's treating everything, I'd put him in the spiral modality, especially when I see some of his other work. And we have to keep on teaching. That's where we are now. And where that's going to be and how it's going to be. There is no one school, we know that. Right now, for all general purposes, it's got to be more or less a peripatetic school. The school is where we are, who's ever teaching. This is one of my students from 2 years ago, Laura Elizabeth. Beautiful work. She had to be, actually, it's interesting, she had to be untrained. She went to a very special school here that taught nothing but the golden section. And so if it didn't fit in the golden section, it couldn't possibly be of any good or any value. And once I sort of showed her how to break it and then put it back where it could be, she really just flew with that. And these are two participants in the studio, Caroline Measley and Brooks Palmer. One working on a relief from a Van Eyck, transposing the painting into a relief. And then on the other, we have a relief of Michelangelo going into a drawing. So once we start to reacquaint our students with things they weren't offered in school at all, and how to bring back content and technique, we're going to see a lot of great results, more than we're seeing now. Like I said, there are more and more people doing this. This is a drawing by Pia Soriano, who did it in Florence. That's me on the left doing the drawing when it was here in Washington. the students went to Florence and drew from all these great, wonderful masterpieces. And that's really where we're coming from and going to. And I think if a lot of the dialogue is done with it, especially on things like composition, modality, and meaning. These are drawings that were being done from the Los Scalzo of St. John the Baptist, completely surrounded by frescoes by Andrea del Sarto. This is Kevin here on the trip doing his drawing from Michelangelo. It's the only chance you're going to get to work in the studios of these masters, is to draw from their work, just like anyone in that period would have done. And we do it through the Catholic Art Guild, but now it's the Catholic Art Institute. With Kathleen Carr, we presented this course in Chicago with the Canons, as I said earlier. We have this wonderful series of lectures offered by St. Patrick's Church in Philadelphia. Thank you all, by the way, for the last few weeks. It's been wonderful. And we've been doing perspective drawing at the Church of St. Rita of Kasha, the Catholic Art Institute. We may be trying to do one between now and Thanksgiving if possible, because it's so large and because we can practice social distancing. We've already done this, where we just sit in different areas, and every seat's the best seat in the house there in terms of doing perspective drawing. And again, back in Florence, this is my little parish of Santa Lucia sul Prato, which I just love. And we have a lot of discussions. This is my friend Marta on the side there talking about the processional crucifix. The art discussions there are amazing, amazing. And one idea is something that happened in the plague of Florence years ago is a fantastic, one of the best fresco painters, Benozzo Gozzoli, who studied under Fra Angelico again. To avoid the plague, he went to this town of San Gimignano, which, as you can see, looks like the Pillars of Creation, and did a wonderful, wonderful fresco series. I've been talking with them about possibly, if things ease up, of taking a trip there, and we could stay at the monastery there, and again, go through all these things. So again, I thank you for your participation, and this is the end of the lecture. So if you have questions, we can start talking now.
And Anthony, so even though we're on mute, we're gonna, just because the end of the formal lecture.
I clicked that. Yeah. There we go. Wow, I did that successfully this time.
So yeah, we can take, you can either raise your hand through pressing the button, or you can just unmute yourself. We can take questions. We have time.
What time is it? I don't have a clock.
A little after 8, so we went just about an hour even, so that's great.
Anthony, thank you very much. This was really peaceful to listen to. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you.
Sure. I had taken an iconography workshop with the Greek, George Cordis, and something he said was that their compositions are based on the Greek letters, the relationship of the different parts of the letters, or something like that. Does that relate to anything that you were talking about, the different modalities?
No, mainly because the icons are all prescribed. You cannot compose them any differently than the way they're composed.
Okay, thank you.
And so it has more to do with rite and ritual, and a symbol becoming a sign form, going from symbol to sign, sign to symbol. We don't do that since the Italo-Byzantine period. That all got changed with the introduction of linear perspective, anatomy, and the availability of light and shade, the availability of all these different types of light and shade. You can't do that with icons. The light is coming from the null space of the gold leaf, and not from any sort of other environment.
Oh,
I mean,
okay.
I love the form. Don't misunderstand me. I don't mean to be constant, but you can't. They're lacking in that ability to reinvent. It's less of a responsibility on one hand as well. It's a lot of times they're just traced from another icon, and that's the way it's supposed to be. It's not a matter of you're cheating or anything. You do usually always start out with Saint Michael, the archangel. That's the
Anthony,
first one.
just to echo a little bit too, maybe this is a little bit of a stretch, but there little Eastern Western difference. Not only icons and architecture kind of they're more strict in terms of always being repeated, but also I'm thinking, at Easter, all of the Orthodox, instead of having a homily, they all read the homily of St. John Chrysostom, which is remarkable. I mean, it's really breathtaking, but it gives you this sense of we do this same thing each time. Even if you take the litanies, all the litanies are much more ritualistic than sometimes our liturgy today, which you even have choices between different Eucharistic prayers, different votive masses so there's more, I think, kind of, ritual in the East. Yeah. Well, we both have it. I mean, we're two lungs,
both
right?
have
Two things, but
We both have it. I mean, we have the Exaltet. This year I got to listen from a former student of mine who's Russian Orthodox in Alaska. He called me on their Holy Saturday, and we all, listened to it on the phone there. It was just wonderful. The reading was just incredible, and you start to see how some of the icons came about, especially the harrowing of hell, where Adam is being awakened by these footsteps. He said, I know those footsteps. They were in the garden before I fell asleep. It's very moving, and very picturesque in a way. But can you reinvent that icon? No, that's the problem.
So anybody else too? Anything you noticed on whether the whole series or this talk? It's an open
I'd
forum.
like
James
to say
raised-
something, Anthony.
Yes.
Mary Zarnicki, I'd like to thank you for the depth of your knowledge. We have a firm called New Traditional Architecture. We've been watching you on the Art Institute. And now the kind of overwhelming feeling I have is that because we do urban design, preservation, and new architecture, these things have been in silos, and I feel like the art is in its silo, that the pastors don't necessarily know to create more. It's always restoring, fixing what was there. To me, it's a living language and alive.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, I know that Institute, what's it called now? The Institute of Classical
The Art Institute. Yeah.
Art Institute, has many different kind of people involved, but yet I'm not seeing that they overlap with what they do together. And
it's part of the situation of transitioning right now. On one hand, we have more churches that are closing than being built. And what do you do with those? Some really wonderful things. Well, in all the churches I've worked on the past some years here in Philadelphia, it really is going to a repository here where you look at them and you say, we want that marble, we want this one, that one. Then that gets confused with restoring a lot of these plaster figures from catalogs that got worn down over the years or chipped or broken and have really, sort of like done their tour of duty. They can be retired now, but we're not. We're hanging on to them for a lot of sentimental value. And in time, that'll be re-examined as well, because we're not restoring a plaster cast. And I can understand the plaster casts, by the way, and why they're so prevalent in American churches. And when we look at what was happening at the turn of the century, how fast the church was developing, we didn't have time. We didn't have the money to employ artists. It was easier to just get a plaster cast, and that's where we wound up with all of them. And so it's a matter of doing and undoing.
Thank you.
Anthony, I had a question. Jim McElwain. Almost overwhelmed by the beauty of what you were showing tonight. I'm just wondering, you know, when you talk about the masters, Botticelli, Da Vinci, Michelangelo, how much direction were they being given by their patrons, by the church hierarchy? Were they told, well, let's do something with Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, or was there greater direction, or did they just take and use their own inspiration?
They were always given. They were always given the content because it was perhaps an altarpiece, etc. Like the Caravaggio I showed last week of Our Lady of the Rosary with all the Dominicans around her.
Mm.
It didn't wind up anywhere, but we know it was a Dominican commission. We just don't have the written evidence of who commissioned this and where was it intended to go. Then on other ones is very, very specific. The Nativity of Da Vinci was meant for Santissima Annunziata in Florence. He didn't finish it. The Saint Anne, the great, what we call the Saint Anne cartoon, that was also unfinished. There were specific commissions though. Same with Michelangelo. All those works are commissioned. The difference is they would give the name of the patron or whatever, but they really left it up to the artist to design it. They entrusted them with that part. And I know that that's the case with Botticelli. I don't think anyone came into those cells that Fra Angelico painted and said, I want this a little bit lighter, darker here, there. No. Because one has to essentially entrust the artist to do this. I could tell you from my experience, I've had people come into my studio and say things like, or see my work and they'll say, why is that one so much better than that one? And I give the same answer all the time. My hands were untied.
Mm.
As soon as I have a client that says, I want this here, that, there,
Mm-hmm.
it just dies. It really does. It takes so much out of it and it's a shame.
Yeah. Okay.
So I don't know if that answers your question.
No,
or not.
it does wonderfully. Yeah. Thanks so much.
Sure.
Anthony, we'll keep going with Q&A. Just one thing to recall, because I apologize in some ways, I cut you off from the beginning. You had said, because we focused previously on St. Francis and the Renaissance and St. Dominic and the Rosary, because you had said it kind of comes together in that we're looking at creation. So St. Francis, great, patron of ecology and the natural world because of his not only love of it, but living within it. And then St. Dominic, I guess he's patron of astrologers, right? That we looked that up.
Astronomy.
Yeah, we
not
did research.
astronomy, not astrology.
You had done both cosmos and plant life. We had looked that up, I guess, in the earliest texts in Jordan of Saxony's book. St. Dominic's godmother at his baptism saw a star on his head. She had this vision of a star.
Right.
But also we had said, what was that again? That there was this.
Sure, it wasn't a nebula. You sure it wasn't the spiral net? It was a star, not a nebula. All right.
I think just a single one. And then remember there was the master of theology who had a dream one night that certain stars had approached him and come close to him. And then the very next day, Dominic and his companions actually showed up for class. They were just passing through town needing to learn. But I do think what those images, it's never just Francis alone in nature. Dominic he's alone, this shining figure. They also have commonality. Francis had brothers. Dominic had brothers. They were luminous because of that. I was really profoundly moved, just as a statement, that you said that art of the past and all of these modalities, it works because it's common, because by intuition the artist works. By intuition we understand. By intuition it connects to life. These common elements. I wanted to ask a single simple question though. So what about taking because a lot of it is indoors, except for like the outside. Like for instance, I'm always fascinated by, there's this indoors, outdoors. When I first made it to Europe and I first visited St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna, I was alarmed in a way, because I'd seen art inside of church and paintings of Christ, etc. But to have the pulpit with carved in this Gothic way with frogs and leaves and just sort of having nature wrought in, is that specifically Gothic when you try to put creation into art? That's my kind of small question.
I think perhaps more, and we can see it with the Gaudi in Barcelona right now, sure. The bringing in the other elements, we see it also on the borders of the Ghiberti doors, same sort of thing. Let's call it international Gothic. But yeah, bringing in all these different elements as much as possible to talk about creation. That it's not just, just the human figure. It's all creation. In essence, tries to become as cosmic as possible. So yeah, we're seeing that revival again, I think.
Father Giles says stars on the ceiling too. That was a thing as well.
Oh, still can be, absolutely. The ceiling is painted blue with stars on it. Interior. Our Lady of Lourdes in Overbrook got repainted that way. Very sort of common practice, whether it's light blue or not usually dark, but can be any shade of blue. It's also the mantle of Mary.
A lot of the capitals on the columns will have various leaf designs from nature, etc.
Yes.
Or flower.
Especially in the Romanesque. Just every capital is completely different. Again, another area.
Just to chip in too, so so a lot of people on the chat, some people, there's just a lot of thanks. So I could read all these messages, but a lot of people are saying thanks, even though they're on mute. Okay. Just anybody else too, questions, further things that came up? We have a few minutes if you'd like to. It's open.
Open mic. One thing to sort of sum it up in a way also is, G.K. Chesterton said something, one statement about art was, art is born when the temporary touches the eternal. So I would change that to when the temporal, then when the worldly touches the eternal. And so whether it's a seashell or a leaf or any of those forms that get entered into it, we are trying to make it as sacramental as possible, I would say. Certainly true. And again, thanks for pointing that out, Father Tim. It is more of seems to be happening more in the Gothic or spiral modalities. We certainly see it in Milan as well, all over the place. All these critters are hiding in and popping out of things.
I think you showed us in Good Way too how creative God is, and then he shared that with human beings, and they instinctually pick up on that and imitate that. We're all these
creation imitating creator.
And that's also, I would just say, is also the life of the virtues. Human life as an art form is imitating God's own goodness, God's own justice. We start to ourselves, even in our behavior, become works of art as we become holy. Yeah.
Well, it becomes for artists, it becomes not only a visual aesthetic, it becomes a moral aesthetic. It is good because it does good.
And it's restoring order. We even talk the whole theology of grace is things got disordered because of our loss of grace, our relationship with God, but it's this restoration of order, a true hierarchy. We're not just talking popes and bishops, but the holy order of creation, human behavior, brother and sister, etc.
Showing forth goodness, beauty, and truth.
Yeah, that's the triad.
Transcendentals.
Indeed.
Beauty, truth, and goodness.
Well, why don't we people can still visit afterwards. Why don't we wrap up just with a very simple prayer? I'll nod to our council elder, Father Giles, who he's been in creation longer than I have. And I'll let him, he spent time here on planet Earth, so he can bless us.
All
He's also
right.
spent time with art, so I'll let him give the final blessing.
Mhm.
Dominicans, and indeed the whole church, and the day by singing to Our Lady the Salve Regina, which we say as Hail, Holy Queen, Mother of Mercy,
Our life, our sweetness, and our hope. To thee do we cry, poor banished children of Eve. To thee do we send up our sighs, mourning and weeping in this valley of tears. Turn then, most gracious Advocate, thine eyes of mercy toward us. And after this our exile, show unto us the blessed fruit of thy womb, Jesus. O clement, O loving, O sweet Virgin Mary. May the blessing of Almighty God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit come down upon you and remain with you forever. Amen. And thanks again, Anthony, for all of your work. I'll say one last thing too. Actually, two things. These are posted on Anthony's Facebook, but also our website. So please share. We record these talks.
Thank you,
to
Anthony.
be shared. So please share with friends. And we also have some of his older talks I'll be adding to a playlist. So we'll have 5 total talks of yours soon available. And it's great to go over these again.
Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Anthony and Father Giles, Father Tim, this is Janet Shane.
See you, Janet. Good to see you. And we're going to be doing this.
Thank you, Janet. We visited Janet at their home. Remember the McShane?
Oh, indeed.
He remembers you. Very, very, very creation-oriented people. The McShanes, both in architecture.
Janet and I were at the academy together 100 years ago.
Were you really?
Yeah.
At Papa. Yeah.
Papa. Papa.
And Janet, we loved your art too. Coming to your home. Well, your home is so historic, but then the art inside, it's all, you're surrounded by art. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. This was wonderful. I want to connect again.
We will.
With drawing or something with you
Okay.
when you at churches. Yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
All right.
Sure
Thanks
thing.
for joining us, Janet.